Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are wrestling with a book that, well, it essentially demands you take everything you learned in high school history class, crumple it up, and just throw it right in the bin.
Yeah, you really do have to unlearn a lot before you even start.
Right. We're talking about Walter Rodney's 1972 classic, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I have to say, even just looking at the title, it feels like a provocation right out of the gate.
Oh, it is absolutely a provocation. It's one of those titles that does a massive amount of heavy lifting before you even open the first page. It completely flips the script on how we talk about global economics.
Yeah, because usually, the word underdeveloped feels very passive. It sounds like a diagnosis of a natural condition, like, oh, that country is underdeveloped, implying they just haven't figured it out yet.
Right, like they're just late to the party.
Exactly. Maybe they're slow, or they missed the memo on the Industrial Revolution. It feels like a race where some people just ran faster than others.
And that is exactly the narrative Rodney is attacking here. He's arguing that underdevelopment isn't a natural state of being behind. It's not about who ran faster. It's a verb.
A verb.
Yeah, it's an active process. You don't just happen to be underdeveloped. You are made underdeveloped.
So his core premise is that Europe didn't just accidentally get rich while Africa accidentally stayed poor.
Precisely. He calls it a dialectical relationship.
Okay.
Now, that sounds a bit academic, but think of it like a seesaw. One side, Europe, went up specifically because the other side, Africa, was being forced down.
Right.
You cannot have the wealth of 18th century London or Bordeaux without the systematic impoverishment of the Gold Coast. They aren't two separate stories. They are the exact same story.
That is just a massive shift in perspective. So the plan for this deep dive is to really take that engine apart. We need to look at what Africa was actually like before the Europeans showed up.
Which is crucial.
Yeah, because I think most of us have a pretty vague, slightly embarrassing mental image of that. And then we need to trace the money.
Yeah.
We need to see exactly how the extraction of people and resources fueled the modern world that you and I live in today.
And to do that, we have to start with the basics. We have to define development. Because if we don't agree on what that word actually means, the rest of the argument just doesn't land.
Well, in the modern world, development usually just means GDP, right? I mean, we look at a spreadsheet.
Yeah, we look at the numbers.
We look at per capita income. If the number is big, you're developed. If it's small, you're not.
And Rodney absolutely hates that metric. He argues that per capita income is often a statistical illusion.
How so? I mean, numbers are numbers, right?
Well, think about it this way. If you have a country with one tycoon making $1 billion a year and 99 people making $0, your average income looks amazing.
Oh, right. The math works out.
The math works, but in reality, 99% of your population is starving. Rodney argues that looking at the money hides the actual reality of the society. It hides the inequality.
So if development isn't just having cash or a high GDP, what is it? How does he define it?
He defines it as a universal social process. It's about a society's ability to control its environment. It's about capacity.
Capacity, oh yeah.
Can you build a dam to control the river? Can you breed a better seed to survive a drought? Can you manufacture tools to make life easier? It's a qualitative change, moving from simple survival to complex mastery of your surroundings, like early China moving from basic farming to producing silk and porcelain.
Okay, so moving from hunter-gatherer to farming is development. Moving from farming to industry is development. It's basically about leveling up your civilization's skill tree.
Exactly. It's an internal growth. And this leads to his definition of underdevelopment. You can only be underdeveloped in relation to someone else.
Because it's comparative.
Right. If the whole world was at the exact same technological level as 15th century Ghana, no one would be underdeveloped. We'd just be human.
We'd all be on the same playing field.
Yes. Underdevelopment happens when that capacity to grow is arrested or stolen. It expresses a relationship of exploitation. A country is underdeveloped because its natural resources and its labor is being extracted to build up another nation.
And he points out that the gap between these nations is getting wider, right? It's not like the underdeveloped nations are slowly catching up.
No, the gap is exploding. Rodney notes that the difference in wealth between the so-called rich and poor nations hasn't just grown a little. It increased 15 to 20 times over the last century and a half from his vantage point.
15 to 20 times.
Yeah. That's not an accident of geography or culture. That is the result of a structural siphon moving wealth from one place to another.
Okay, so let's test that structure. Because the standard defense, the thing you'll inevitably hear if you argue about this at a dinner party, is, well, colonialism was bad, sure, but Africa was backward anyway, the Europeans brought civilization.
Which is the classic white savior myth that Rodney spends the first massive chunk of the book dismantling. He does this forensic reconstruction of Africa pre-1500, right before the European encounter.
And what did he find?
He finds a continent that was developing independently, successfully, and in many ways parallel to Europe.
So definitely not just mud huts and chaos.
Far from it. Most of the continent was in a transitional stage. They were moving from communalism, where land was shared by families, toward feudalism, where you start to see states, empires, and social stratification. It was a very dynamic, changing place.
But hold on, we have to address the elephant in the room here. People always say, but Africans enslaved each other first. Slavery was already there.
And Rodney tackles this head-on. He acknowledges that, yes, forms of servitude existed in Africa, just as they did in Europe and Asia. But he makes a really crucial distinction here. In Africa, slavery was not the dominant mode of production.
Meaning the economy didn't rely entirely on it.
Exactly. It was incidental. A person might be in servitude for a debt or as a prisoner of war, but they often had rights. They could marry into the family. Their children were often born free.
So it wasn't a permanent underclass.
Right. It wasn't the dehumanizing industrial chattel slavery that Europe later introduced, where humans were quite literally just farm equipment. The entire structure of the society wasn't built on the back of the slave.
Got it. So let's look at the achievements then. The book lists some examples of technology that really surprised me. I think we vastly underestimate the agriculture, for one.
The agriculture was brilliant. You had societies practicing terracing, complex irrigation, crop rotation, and green manuring.
They actually understood soil chemistry.
They did. They knew how to keep the land fertile without modern chemical fertilizers. But honestly, the manufacturing is where the primitive myth really falls apart completely.
You mentioned the textiles in our pre-show chat.
Oh, the Guinea Coast cotton. This is fascinating. When the Portuguese first arrived in the 15th century, they didn't bring better cloth to trade. In fact, the African cloth was superior.
Superior to European cloth.
Yes. It was stronger, better woven, and more durable than what was coming out of Manchester or the European textile centers at the time. The Europeans actually bought African cloth to resell it elsewhere because it was a premium product.
That is wild. We always think of Manchester as the absolute textile capital of the world.
It became that later, but it wasn't destined to be. And then there's the leather, Moroccan leather.
Yeah, the fancy stuff. I'm pretty sure I overpaid for a wallet made of it once.
Well, you fell for a historical branding trick. Rodney points out that Moroccan leather was almost entirely produced by Hausa and Mandinga specialists in what is now Nigeria and Mali.
Really? So not Morocco.
It's not Morocco. They had developed highly sophisticated tanning and dyeing techniques. The leather was just traded through North Africa to get to Europe. So the Europeans named it after the port they bought it from, not the actual producers, but the chemistry, the skill. That was entirely West African.
It's like buying Swiss chocolate that was actually made in Ghana.
It's exactly like that. And we can't ignore the mining either. Katanga and Zambia, the copper belt. They were mining and smelting copper that was so pure. When European traders later tried to sell their own copper to these regions, the Africans just laughed at them.
They didn't want it.
They rejected the European product completely because the quality was visibly inferior to what they were already making.
I think the most visual proof of this capacity, though, is the architecture. Everyone knows the pyramids in Egypt, but Rodney points south to Great Zimbabwe.
Great Zimbabwe is undeniable proof of advanced engineering. You have these massive granite walls standing 30 feet high, and here's the kicker, there is no mortar.
No cement at all.
No cement. It's dry stone engineering. The stones are cut and placed so precisely that gravity alone holds them together for centuries. That requires advanced mathematics, it requires specialized architects, and it requires a social organization to mobilize a massive labor force. You just don't build Great Zimbabwe by accident.
And the trade networks, too. I remember reading about silent barter in school, this idea that Africans were too scared or primitive to talk, so they left gold on the beach and ran away. Rodney really goes after that story.
He shreds it. He argues that silent barter wasn't about being dumb or scared. It was a very specific trade protocol for dealing with strangers to avoid conflict.
The diplomatic tool.
Exactly. And more importantly, look at the Mandinga merchants. They were trading gold all across the Sahara. They used precise gold weights called the benda and sensitive scales. They were managing complex currency exchange rates across a desert that is bigger than the continental United States.
Wow.
That is a highly sophisticated commercial system.
So we have established that pre-1500 Africa is farming, smelting, weaving, building, and trading. It is developing. Then comes the 15th century. The ships arrive. What changes?
The control of the ocean changes. Europe takes control of the shipping lanes. And because they controlled the logistics, they could dictate the terms of trade. They assign Africa a brand new role in the global economy.
And not as a partner?
No, as a supplier. And specifically, a supplier of human captives.
This is where we need to follow the money. We all know the human cost is the absolute misery of the slave trade. But Rodney asks a really pointed, so what question regarding Europe? How did this trade physically build Europe?
He argues that the profits from the slave trade provided the primary capital, the literal cash that funded the Industrial Revolution. We often have this great man theory of history, right, where James Watt invents a steam engine and suddenly, boom, factories everywhere.
Right, the lone genius.
But an invention is completely useless if you don't have the money to build the machine.
You need venture capital.
Exactly. And where did that massive influx of capital come from? It came from the triangular trade. The profits from selling slaves and the profits from the slave labor plantations in the Caribbean flooded back into England and France.
Rodney names names here, which I found really grounding. It's not just abstract money, it's specific companies that we still know today.
It is startlingly direct. Take Barclays Bank.
A huge global bank.
Yes. The Barclay brothers were deeply involved in the slave trade in the mid-1700s. The capital base of that bank has roots in the trade. Or Lloyd's of London. Today, they're an absolute insurance giant.
Right.
They started as a coffee house where merchants gathered to insure slave ships. The entire financial infrastructure of the City of London was basically built to manage the risk and profit of selling human beings.
And even the technology itself. You mentioned James Watt earlier.
Yeah. James Watt, the father of the steam engine, who financed him. His financial backers were West Indian slave owners. The surplus value extracted from an enslaved African cutting cane in Jamaica was literally reinvested into the technology that made Britain the workshop of the world.
That is a crazy connection.
The steam engine runs on African labor, historically speaking.
There's a physical artifact of this too, right? The guinea coin. That part really stuck with me.
Yes, the British gold coin struck in 1663. It was literally called the guinea because it was minted from gold imported from the Guinea coast of West Africa. The very currency of the British Empire was made of extracted African resources.
Before we move to the impact on Africa itself, I want to touch on the ideology because we usually think racism caused slavery. We think Europeans looked down on Africans, so they enslaved them. Rodney says we have that entirely backward.
This is a critical insight in the book. Rodney argues that slavery caused racism. Europeans were driven by economic necessity. They wanted cheap labor to maximize profit. They enslaved Africans for the money.
Pure capitalism.
Pure extraction. But you can't be a good Christian and also treat human beings like farm equipment. It creates a massive moral conflict in the society. So to resolve that conflict, they invented the ideology of white superiority.
So racism was the rationalization. It was the excuse.
Exactly. It was the mental tool used to justify the economic system. You tell yourself they aren't fully human or they need to be civilized, and suddenly the brutality is acceptable to the public.
That is a chilling but incredibly convincing argument. Okay, so Europe is getting rich. They are accumulating capital, building banks, fueling industry. But the book is called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
Yeah.
How did this trade actively break Africa's ability to develop?
It wasn't just one thing. It was a combination of mechanisms that created a spiral of decline. The first, obviously, is the population drain.
But it's not just the sheer numbers, right? It's who was taken.
Correct. If you take the elderly or the sick, a society can arguably absorb that economic loss over time. But the slave trade specifically targeted the young and the healthy, the core labor force.
The people who actually do the work.
The people who would have been inventing the next tool, farming the next harvest, raising the next generation. Rodney notes that between 1650 and 1900, the populations of Europe and Asia doubled or even tripled. Africa's population stagnated. It stayed completely flat.
And when you stop population growth, you stop innovation.
In many ways, yes. Pressure drives innovation. If you don't have more mouths to feed, you don't need to invent better farming techniques. It froze the continent's demographic dynamism.
And speaking of innovation, let's talk about technological arrest. This was the part of the book that really made me angry. It wasn't just that they stopped inventing, it's that they actually forgot things they used to know.
This is the tragedy of free trade with unequal partners. We talked about that high-quality African cloth earlier. Well, once the trade opened up, Europe flooded the African market with cheap, mass-produced textiles.
From the new factories.
Right. It was lower quality, but it was everywhere. African weavers just couldn't compete with the sheer volume and price.
So the local industry goes out of business.
And when the industry dies, the knowledge dies with it. A generation later, the apprentices haven't been trained. The technology is lost. Africa went from being a producer of finished goods to a dependent buyer of European goods. They lost their technological sovereignty.
And then there's the gun trap. This feels like the ultimate catch-22 situation.
It is diabolical. African rulers saw European power, and they wanted it. They wanted the factories, the refineries, the tech. But Europe said no. They would sell the finished product, but never the means of production.
They'd sell you a musket, but never the blueprint to build one yourself.
Yeah, right, because he who makes the powder wins the war. And in a volatile region, if your neighbor buys a gun from a European trader, you must buy a gun to survive.
An arms race.
A forced arms race. But the Europeans would only accept one form of payment for those gun slaves. So to protect your people, you have to raid your neighbor to capture slaves, to buy guns, to protect your people.
It's a perpetual violence machine manufactured by the trade terms.
Exactly. And think about the brain drain there. Instead of your best minds thinking, how do we irrigate this valley? Or how do we build a better loom? They are focused entirely on warfare and raiding. It diverted the entire creative energy of the continent into destruction.
The final nail in the coffin, according to Rodney, is how the economy was physically organized. The literal map of the continent.
Yes, the distortion of the economy. Before the Europeans, African trade was a web. It went north-south, east-west. The forest zone traded with the savannah traded with the desert. It was an integrated internal economy.
And Europe cut the web.
They forced everything to the coast. The Portuguese actually banned canoe traffic between the Ivory Coast and Gold Coast.
They made it illegal to trade locally.
Yes. They didn't want Africans trading with each other. They wanted everyone facing the ocean, handing goods directly to the European ships.
So you get what Rodney calls the one-armed bandit economy.
Exactly. You have an extraction sector taking things out like slaves, ivory, rubber, minerals, and an import sector bringing in cheap manufactured junk like gin and beads. But there is no internal integration.
The pieces don't connect.
The different parts of the African economy stopped talking to each other. They just talk to Europe. And if you look at a map of African infrastructure today, the railways often still lead straight from the mine to the port. They don't connect the internal cities to each other.
That is the legacy right there. The underdevelopment isn't just history. It's the physical tracks on the ground today.
That is Rodney's ultimate conclusion. You cannot look at African poverty today and ask, what did they do wrong? You have to look at the system that was built meticulously over centuries to extract value from them.
It really forces you to abandon the idea of charity as a solution.
It does. It shifts the conversation entirely. If the poverty was created by active extraction, you can't fix it with a little bit of aid. You have to address the structural relationship. You have to stop the extraction.
It's a heavy realization, but I think it's the only way to make sense of the modern world.
I agree. It's an absolutely necessary reframing.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a bit of a thought experiment based on everything we've covered. We've talked about the gold, the ivory, the millions of lives lost to the trade.
I want you to imagine the what if. What would the global economy look like today if those millions of young, skilled, brilliant Africans had remained on the continent?
Right.
If their energy had gone into farming, inventing, and building their own societies instead of building America and Europe? What if the gold of the Guinea coast had been used to capitalize African banks instead of Lloyd's of London?
We'll never know the answer. But understanding that the potential was there and was actively engineered away is the first step in seeing the world clearly.
Couldn't have said it better.
Thanks for diving deep with us on Walter Rodney. We'll see you next time.